The notes fell from her fingers like cool water, a melody she knew better than her own name. Each key was a memory, a ghost under her touch. The light blue fabric of the uniform felt stiff against her skin, a costume for a life that wasn't hers. Around her, the murmur of the party was a distant ocean, the clinking of champagne flutes and the low hum of expensive conversations fading into the background. There was only the polished black expanse of the grand piano and the song, a sad, sweet piece by Chopin she hadn't played in years. A shift in the room's atmosphere, subtle as a change in air pressure, made her falter. Her gaze lifted from the keys, scanning the crowd of tailored suits and glittering dresses. Then she found him. He stood near the marble fireplace, a statue carved from shadows and steel. Kwon Jin-woo. The name was a scar on her memory. He hadn't changed. The suit was immaculate, a dark gray Tom Ford that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. His posture was a study in controlled power, a predator at rest. But it was his eyes that stole the air from her lungs. They were the same, dark, depthless, and fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He didn't see her, not really. He saw a maid, a piece of the scenery who happened to be creating a pleasant sound. That ignorance was her only shield. She forced her attention back to the piano, her fingers finding the familiar chords. She was Amara, a new hire, the girl who cleaned the guest suites and polished the endless silver. She was invisible. She had to be. Working here was an act of desperation, a last resort after her grant money for the conservatory ran out. She'd never imagined the anonymous agency would place her here, in the one house in all of Los Angeles she would have paid to avoid. A shadow fell over the keyboard. A woman in a blood-red dress, tight as a second skin, stood over her. Her blonde hair was swept into a severe style, and her lips were painted the same aggressive crimson as her gown. This was Isabella, the fiancée. Amara had seen her in photographs, a beautiful, brittle creature always clinging to Jin-woo's arm. "That's enough," Isabella said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The party's hum quieted as heads turned their way. The help shouldn't be the center of attention. Amara's hands froze over the keys. The final, lingering note of the nocturne died in the sudden, heavy silence. She started to rise, to offer a quiet apology and retreat back into the invisibility she craved. But Isabella wasn't finished. She took a step closer, her expression a mask of disdain. "And keep your dirty hands off my things." The words were a slap. Before Amara could process the insult, Isabella shoved her. Not a gentle push, but a violent, contemptuous thrust. Amara lost her balance, her heel catching on the leg of the piano bench. She stumbled backward, a strangled gasp escaping her lips as she hit the cold, unforgiving marble floor. Her head connected with a sickening thud. The world tilted, the glittering chandeliers swimming in her vision. The room went absolutely silent. It was a dead, breathless quiet, the kind that precedes an explosion. Through the ringing in her ears, Amara heard one sound. The soft, deliberate click of a man's dress shoes moving across the floor. She didn't have to look to know who it was. The air itself seemed to part for him. He moved like the room owed him space. Jin-woo stopped beside her. He didn't look at Isabella. He didn't look at the stunned guests. His entire universe seemed to narrow to the small, crumpled space she occupied on the floor. He knelt, not a gesture of supplication, but one of assessment, his movements economical and precise. "Are you all right?" His voice was a low rumble, gravel over silk. It was the same voice that had once whispered promises to her in the dark, and the sound of it now was a fresh wound. She tried to push herself up, her pride stinging more than the back of her head. "I'm fine." The words were a weak rasp. He ignored her, his gaze dropping to her arm, where a long, angry scrape was already beginning to well with blood. His fingers, long and elegant, brushed against her skin, and a jolt went through her, hot and unwelcome. It was a touch she had spent 5 years trying to forget. His brow furrowed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something in his dark eyes. It couldn't be recognition. Not after all this time. Not when she looked so different. Her hair braided back, her face thinner, her body hidden in this shapeless uniform. He rose to his full height, turning his head just enough to address the room without truly looking at anyone. "The evening is over," he stated. It wasn't a request. It was an execution. Immediately, the spell broke. Guests began to murmur, gathering their things, their eyes darting between Jinwoo, the furious woman in red, and the maid on the floor. They moved with a quiet urgency, eager to escape the storm they all felt brewing. Isabella finally spoke, her voice shrill with indignation. "Jinwoo, what are you doing?" "She's just a servant." He turned his head slowly, and the coldness in his gaze was absolute. "She is a person in my house who is injured." "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout, "will wait for me in the library. Do not speak to anyone." He didn't wait for her reply. He turned back to Amara, extending a hand. She hesitated. Taking his hand felt like a surrender, a step back into a world she had nearly died to escape. But the eyes of his remaining staff were on her, and her head was spinning. She placed her trembling fingers in his. His grip was firm, warm, and overwhelmingly familiar. He pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. The world swayed, and she instinctively put a hand on his arm to steady herself. The fabric of his suit was impossibly fine, the muscle beneath it hard as stone. "Come with me," he commanded softly. He led her away from the grand hall, his hand a firm pressure on the small of her back, guiding her through a maze of corridors she hadn't yet been cleared to clean. They walked in silence, the only sound the echo of their footsteps on the polished floors. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with 5 years of unsaid things. He led her into a vast, dark-paneled office. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for a single, gleaming laptop. The air smelled of old leather, cedar, and something else, the faint, clean scent of his cologne. He gestured to a leather armchair. "Seat." She obeyed, perching on the edge of the cushion. He disappeared through a side door and returned a moment later with a first aid kit. He knelt before her again, opening the box. The clinical, antiseptic smell filled the air. "Give me your arm," he said. She extended it numbly. He took her forearm in one hand, his thumb resting just over her pulse point. His touch was gentle now, methodical, as he cleaned the scrape with an antiseptic wipe. The sting made her flinch. "I apologize for Isabella's behavior," he said, his eyes focused on his task. "It was unacceptable." "It's fine," she mumbled, looking anywhere but at him. Her gaze fell on a small, barely visible scar just below his left eye, a thin white line against his tan skin. It was new. He finished cleaning the wound and applied a bandage with surgical precision. His fingers lingered for a moment too long on her skin. He looked up then, and his eyes met hers. Really met them. He studied her face, his gaze tracing the line of her jaw, the shape of her mouth, the curve of her brow. The casual assessment was gone, replaced by a dawning, sharp-edged focus. "I haven't seen the new staff rosters," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What is your name?" This was it. The moment the shield shattered. She could lie. She could give a false name and hope he'd dismiss her, let her dissolve back into the background. But the lie felt heavy and useless in her throat. His eyes were pinning her in place, stripping away the uniform, the years, the carefully constructed walls. "Amara," she whispered. The name hung in the air between them. His entire body went still. He didn't just hear the name, he felt it. His hand dropped from her arm as if burned. He stood up slowly, taking a step back. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with shock and disbelief. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Seeing the woman he had married in a quiet courthouse ceremony 6 years ago. The woman he had divorced in a sterile lawyer's office a year later. "Amara," he repeated, and the way he said it was different. It was her name, the one he had once owned, broken and remade on his tongue. It wasn't a question. It was a ghost story. "It can't be." His composure, The unshakable calm that was his trademark finally cracked. A storm of emotions passed over his face. Confusion, anger, and something else she couldn't name. Something that looked like pain. "They told me you were dead," he said, the words raw, forced from his chest.
À car accident.
In Chicago. 2 years ago. Her breath caught. Dead? Someone had told him she was dead? The divorce had been clean, brutal, and final. His lawyers had given her a settlement generous enough to disappear on, with the clear, unspoken understanding that she was to do just that. Vanish from his life, from his world, forever. She had taken the money, moved to Chicago to study music, and tried to build a new life on the ashes of the old one. She had never imagined he would think she was dead. "Who told you that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "That is not your concern." The mask was back, the walls slamming into place. He turned away from her, running a hand through his perfectly styled black hair. He paced the length of the room, a caged tiger. "What are you doing here?" "In my house. Working as a maid." The accusation was clear. He thought this was a scheme, a manipulation. "I needed a job," she said, the simple truth sounding absurd in this opulent room. "The agency sent me. I didn't know it was this house. Not until I saw you tonight." He stopped pacing and faced her. "You expect me to believe that?" "It's the truth." Jinwoo, saying his name felt like swallowing glass. "My funding ran out. I had nowhere else to go. It was a coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidences," he bit out. "Not in my world." He looked at her, at the cheap blue dress and the worn-out shoes peeking from beneath the hem. He was seeing the 5 years she'd lived without him, the struggle, the fall from the quiet luxury she had briefly known. He was seeing her failure. And for the first time, she saw his. The failure to protect her, to keep his world from touching hers, which had been the entire point of their divorce. He had pushed her away to keep her safe, and in the end, he hadn't even known if she was alive. That was his wound. The woman he had failed to protect was kneeling at his feet in a servant's uniform. He walked to his desk and pressed a button on an intercom. "Send Mr. Park to my study."
Now.
A moment later, a severe-looking man in a dark suit entered, bowing his head slightly. Mr. Park, his head of security. Amara remembered him. He had never approved of her. "Mr. Park," Jinwoo said, his voice cold and commanding. "Escort Amara to the East Wing guest suite. The one at the end of the hall. Post a guard at her door. She is not to leave the room for any reason. She is not to speak to anyone. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Mr. Park said, his eyes flicking to Amara with a flicker of confusion before becoming impassive once more. "Wait," Amara said, standing up. "You can't just lock me in a room. I haven't done anything." Jinwoo turned his full attention back to her. The look in his eyes was chilling. "You walked back into my life. That is what you have done," he said. "Until I understand how and why, you are a security risk. You are a loose end. And I do not tolerate loose ends." He paused, his gaze dropping to the bandage on her arm. For a second, the coldness wavered. "You are also under my protection. Whether you like it or not. Go with him." She had a choice. She could scream, fight, try to run. But she knew how this world worked. Running would only confirm his suspicions and put her in more danger. Staying, for now, was the only move. It was a deliberate choice to survive. She met his gaze, holding it for a long, silent moment. A silent war passed between them. Of history, of betrayal, of a connection that refused to die. Then, she turned and followed Mr. Park out of the room, the weight of Jinwoo's stare on her back like a physical force. She was a prisoner in the house that had once been her home. The guest suite was more luxurious than any apartment she had ever lived in. A 4-poster bed, a silk chaise lounge, a private balcony overlooking the city lights. It was a gilded cage. For 2 days, she saw no one but a silent maid who brought her meals. She spent the time pacing, her mind racing. Who had told Jinwoo she was dead?
And why?
The divorce was meant to be an eraser, wiping her from his world so he could fully embrace his role as the heir to his father's empire. An empire built on secrets and blood. Their marriage had been a secret, a youthful rebellion he could no longer afford. On the third night, the door opened without a knock. Jin-woo entered, dressed not in a suit, but in a simple black t-shirt and gray sweatpants. It was the way she remembered him from the quiet moments, the late nights when he wasn't a boss, just a man. He looked tired. He carried a tablet in one hand. He didn't speak, just walked to the center of the room and set the tablet on a small table, turning it to face her. On the screen was a grainy security photo. A car, wrapped around a telephone pole, its frame twisted and blackened. "This is the accident report I was given," he said, his voice flat. A woman was pulled from the wreckage, burned beyond recognition. The dental records matched yours. Amara stared at the screen, her stomach churning. "That's impossible. My records were switched," he finished for her. The coroner was on a rival's payroll. The same rival whose family I am set to merge with through my marriage to Isabella. It all clicked into place. The lie wasn't random. It was a strategic move in a war she knew nothing about. They had wanted him to believe she was gone, truly gone, so he would be untethered, free to make the alliance they needed. Her existence was a liability to them. "Isabella's family," she breathed. "They did this." "I am still confirming the details," he said, his expression unreadable. "But it seems my fiancée has been lying to me about more than just her temperament." He looked at her then, and the distance between them seemed to shrink. "You shouldn't be here, Amara. I let you go to keep you safe. I drew a line between my world and yours, and you crossed it." "I told you I didn't know," she insisted. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said, taking a step closer. "You're here now. And they know you're here. Isabella saw you. She knows who you are."
How?
"No one knew about us. Her father's people are thorough. They must have had old surveillance. When you showed up on the employee roster, it must have triggered an alert. Her little performance at the party, that wasn't just jealousy. It was a message, a threat. A cold dread washed over her. She wasn't just an inconvenient ex-wife. She was a target. She had walked into the lion's den wearing a sign that said bait. This was the moment she almost lost everything, the moment she understood the true scope of the danger. She wasn't just adjacent to it. She was at its center. She did something then that surprised them both. She walked over to the tablet, picked it up, and began swiping through the attached files. Police reports, witness statements, all falsified. She found a reference to the morgue the body was taken to. "This coroner," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "What happened to him?" Jin-woo watched her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "He retired suddenly, moved to another country a week after filing the report." "Find him," she said, looking up from the screen, her eyes locking with his. She was crossing a line, stepping out of the role of victim and into something else. She was no longer just a musician, a maid. She was a woman who had been marked for death, and she was done being passive. "Find him, and you'll find your proof. You'll have the leverage you need against her family." She was helping him, offering him a weapon. In that moment, she stopped being someone he needed to protect and became an ally, an asset. The dynamic between them shifted, became something sharper, more dangerous. He stared at her for a long time, the silence stretching. He saw the fire in her, the intelligence he had always admired, the resilience he had forgotten. He had tried to protect a fragile thing, but he was realizing Amara was not fragile at all. He reached out, his fingers brushing a loose braid back from her face. His touch was feather-light, almost hesitant. "You were never supposed to come back into this world," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. The confession was not one of love, but of a grim, possessive truth. "Now that you are, I will not lose you again." The threat was implicit. He would burn the world down to keep her in it. The fiancé, the rival family, the entire empire he was meant to inherit. None of it mattered as much as the woman standing before him, the ghost who had come back to life. The next move came sooner than they expected. The guard outside her door was changed. The new one was a man she didn't recognize, his face hard and his eyes cold. He didn't meet her gaze. A quiet alarm bell rang in her mind. Jin-woo's men were loyal to a fault. This man felt different. When her dinner arrived that evening, brought by the new guard instead of the maid, she knew something was wrong. The plate was uncovered, the food smelling faintly of something bitter, something like almonds. She didn't touch it. She thought back to the files, to the network of names and connections she had glimpsed. Isabella's family didn't just play games with paperwork, they were ruthless. They wouldn't wait for Jinwoo to act. They would eliminate the problem. They would eliminate her. She had to act. She couldn't wait for Jinwoo to save her. She had to save herself. She remembered Mr. Park, the unwavering loyalty in his eyes. He was her only chance. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the heavy silk curtains. It was a risk, a desperate, insane plan, but it was better than sitting here, waiting for poison to do its work. She ripped a long strip from the lining of a curtain, then walked to the heavy mahogany wardrobe. She wedged the strip of fabric into the top of the door, tying the other end to the heavy brass handle, creating a makeshift pulley. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Hours passed. Then she heard the key in the lock. She pulled on the fabric with all her might. The wardrobe door, freed from its latch, swung open and crashed to the floor with a sound like a thunderclap. The guard burst in, his gun drawn. In that split second of distraction, she threw the heavy porcelain water pitcher from the nightstand at his head. It struck him with a sickening crack, and he crumpled to the floor. She didn't wait.
She ran.
She flew down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet. She had to find Mr. Park. She remembered his office was on the ground floor, near the security hub. She took the service stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Every shadow was an enemy. Every sound was a threat. She found the office, the door slightly ajar. Peeking inside, she saw Mr. Park at his desk, speaking urgently into a phone. He looked tense, his face grim. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. He looked up, his eyes widening in shock, his hand immediately going to the gun at his hip. "He tried to poison me," she gasped out, leaning against the doorframe. "The new guard. He's one of theirs." Mr. Park's face hardened. He didn't question her.
He didn't hesitate.
He spoke a single, sharp word in Korean into the phone and hung up. He was already moving, pulling her further into the room. "Stay here. Do not move." Moments later, the house erupted in quiet, controlled chaos. Men in dark suits moved through the halls with deadly efficiency. Amara stayed where she was, listening to the muffled shouts, the sound of a brief struggle. Then, silence. Jinwoo appeared in the doorway. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed for war. His eyes found her, and the relief that washed over his face was so profound it was like a physical blow. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders, his gaze scanning her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight.
No, I'm okay.
He pulled her against him, a rough, desperate embrace that had nothing to do with tenderness and everything to do with a fear he would never admit to. His hand tangled in her hair, holding her head against his chest. She could feel the frantic beating of his heart. "I should have known they would move this fast," he ground out, his voice a low growl against her hair. "I underestimated her." He held her for a moment longer, then released her, his expression hardening back into a mask of cold fury. Mr. Park returned, his face grim. "We have him. He's talking." It was Isabella. The order came directly from her. That was it. The final piece. The undeniable proof. Jinwoo looked at Amara. "She signed her own death warrant," he said, the words flat and cold. But Amara shook her head. Killing Isabella would start a war, a bloodbath that would pull him down, pull everything down. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "There's a better way. You don't need a war. You need to win." She had been a pawn, a ghost, a victim. Now, she was a player. She knew his world was built on power, but also on appearances. Humiliation could be a more potent weapon than a bullet. She laid it out for him. A plan not of violence, but of surgical destruction. They had the confession from the guard. They had the proof about the faked death certificate. They would not use it to start a war. They would use it to end one. The next evening, Jin-woo hosted a dinner. Not a party, but an intimate gathering. Isabella was there, radiant in white, her confidence restored. Her father was there, a formidable man with cold eyes. Jin-woo was the perfect host, calm and attentive. Amara was not there. Not at first. At the end of the meal, Jin-woo stood. He spoke of alliances, of trust, of the future of their two families. Then, he looked at Isabella. There is just one piece of old business to resolve before we can move forward. The doors to the dining room opened, and Amara walked in. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform. She wore a simple, elegant black dress she had found in the sweets closet. Her hair was down, framing her face. She looked directly at Isabella's father. The man's face went pale. Isabella shot to her feet, her face a mask of fury and panic. What is the meaning of this? This, Jin-woo said, his voice like ice, is Amara Kwan, my first wife. The woman your people paid a coroner to declare dead 2 years ago. He placed a tablet on the table. A video began to play. It was the guard confessing everything. The poison. The order from Isabella. Isabella lunged for the tablet, but Mr. Park was there, blocking her path. Her father sat frozen, his empire crumbling around him in a single, perfectly executed move. He was ruined, not by violence, but by the truth. The merger is off, Jin-woo said calmly. You will transfer 60% of your assets to my control as compensation for your attempted murder of a member of my family. You will do this by morning. If you do not, this video, along with the evidence of your conspiracy, will be sent to every rival you have. You will be erased. There was no negotiation. There was only absolute surrender. Isabella was dragged from the room, screaming. Her father sat, defeated, a ghost at the table. A cost had been paid. An alliance was destroyed. A war had been averted, but the peace was fragile. Jin-woo had exposed a weakness, his past, his heart, but he had turned it into a devastating strength. After they were gone, the room was silent. Jin-woo walked over to Amara, who stood by the window, looking out at the city lights.
He didn't speak.
He didn't need to. He had made his choice. In front of his most dangerous rival, he had not called her his ex-wife. He had called her a member of his family. He had claimed her. He came to stand behind her, his presence a warm, solid weight in the vast, empty room. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. Is it over? She asked softly. With them, yes, he answered. With us, it's just beginning. He was right. Nothing was simple. The world outside these walls was still lethal. But in this moment, there was a quiet truth. She had not been rescued. She had stood her ground, used her mind, and fought back. She had saved him from a disastrous war as much as he had saved her from a poison plate. They were partners in a way they had never been before. She turned to face him. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the man beneath the Mafia boss, the man she had married. The vulnerability was there, in the depths of his dark eyes. He had lost her once. He would not do it again. He lifted a hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. I told myself letting you go was the only way to keep you safe, he said, his voice raw with an emotion he rarely showed. I was wrong. The only way to keep you safe is to keep you with me. It wasn't a promise of a fairy tale. It was a statement of fact in a life where safety was a commodity bought with power and blood. She leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance.
A choice. Her choice. To stay.
To fight. To claim her place in this dangerous, beautiful, complicated world, right beside him. The city lights glittered below, a sea of a million stories, but hers was here, in this room, with this man. And for the first time in 5 years, it felt like home.